Okay, the purpose of the screencast is to go over and better understand the motivation behind the events and queries lesson. All right, so before I jump into talking about events and queries themselves, we have to understand a little bit more about picos themselves. Okay, so there's a section right here. I'm not going to read the entire thing to you, but essentially, picos are a digital representation of something. Okay, that something could be something physical, like a temperature sensor, or it could be more conceptual, like in a collection of sensors. Okay. Now, on a given pico, there are rule sets installed that give that pico the behavior you would expect. Like if it was a temperature sensor, for example, I've got one right here. I've got a sensor pico right here. If I want it to behave like a sensor, I need to define a rule set called, I just called it sensor test, and I need to install this rule set on this pico. Okay. If we want to look at what this sensor test rule set does, we'll just look at it right here, but I'll explain that a little bit later. Okay. So just understand that picos have rule sets which give them whatever behavior you expect. All right. So how do you get the behavior you want? How do you interact with a pico? Okay, those are where events and queries come in. So an event is essentially like, let's say a temperature wakes up every minute, right? And every minute it's going to send an event to a pico that says like new temperature reading or something like that. Okay, that's an event. A query would be something like an HTTP GET, where you're saying, what's the current temperature, right? You're saying, get me the current temperature from the pico. I made a little diagram right here that I hope will help you understand the difference between the two, okay? So at first glances, here's the query and here's the event. At first glance, essentially all you're doing with this temperature sensor pico for a query is you're sending the query, which is this line right here, and you're getting a response, okay? Now a query, all it's really doing is calling a single function that's defined on one of the rule sets installed in this pico, okay? It's just calling that function. And as functions are, they're not allowed in KRL to have any sort of side effects or actions or anything. All they do is return a response. Events, however, are allowed to do so much more than that, okay? So it still kind of looks a little bit the same. It sends some sort of event with some sort of description, maybe some attributes, to the temperature sensor pico. And the temperature sensor pico returns a list of directives to whoever called it. Now, I won't talk a whole lot about what directives are. You can kind of think of them like a response. Whoever called or sent the original event could do something with directives. It could provide information about what's happening, whatever. But that doesn't really matter too much right now. The important thing to notice are all these other lines over here. From an event, a temperature sensor could do all sorts of different things. For example, let's say the temperature was too hot. If it's too hot, it could maybe send a text message to you saying, hey, your temperature's too hot inside your house or something. Maybe turn on the AC. It could modify its internal state. It could keep track. It could have a big array of temperatures, essentially. And every time you get a new temperature reading, it just kind of appends it to the array. Maybe this pico, if it receives a new temperature reading, might want to send an event to a different pico. Maybe there's a collection of picos that's kind of watching over it, and the collection pico might be interested in things that happen as a result of this original event that you sent out. And of course, another excellent thing you could do is chain more events. Let's say you got a new sensor reading, but you don't know if it's a humidity or a temperature reading yet. So you could have one rule that kind of processes that, figures out, oh, this is actually a humidity reading, and then it raises or chains a new humidity reading event within that pico. There's all sorts of different things you could do. So that's the biggest thing I want you to walk away from the screencast with, is understanding that the only thing queries do are call a function and get a response. Events are allowed to do so much more, okay? To give you a little taste of what that looks like, I'll just open up this rule set that I made This is just an example sensor rule set, right? I have a function called getTemperature that would line up with this query right here, getTemperature. All it's going to do is call the function and give it a response. All I'm doing is doing a little pre-processing. Maybe I'm calculating the current temperature or something, and I'm returning the temperature. That's what this last line of the function does. If this were a real application, I would use internal state, like I would keep track of the current temperature. I wouldn't do this 2 + 2 thing, but that's saved for a different lesson another day. The event, because it's so much more complicated, you have to define it somewhere else. That's defined inside this rule, okay? So this rule essentially has 3 parts to it. There's a pre-block, an action block, and a postlude, okay? Now, the purpose of this lesson isn't to talk about all these different parts of a rule. Rather, just be aware that all these different blocks help you achieve this goal of taking action, okay? Whether it's sending a text message, whether it's modifying state, whether it's sending or raising events, it doesn't matter. The different blocks will help you achieve that, okay? And you'll learn a little bit more about that later. What I want to focus on right now is just the fact that you can send events and send queries, okay? So how you do that. Let's start off with going back to the documentation. If you scroll down a little bit, you'll notice that there are some URLs here, okay? So how you send a query and how you send an event are similar in the fact that you're using HTTP, okay? Everything from queries to events all use HTTP or HTTPS, and you essentially just list the location of where your engine's running, followed by /sky/event for events or cloud for queries. And I don't want to talk super in depth about the format of these. You can kind of look up the documentation on your own, or you can read these parts on your own. But just be aware that you can call or you can send queries and events in multiple methods with different ways. For example, let's go ahead and make a query. Let's call that getTemperature function, okay? If I wanted to call it, I could actually just do it in the browser just like this. You'll see that I've actually already called it in the past. If I just hit enter, you'll see that there's a little error, but I'll talk about that in just a second. I did that on purpose. If you look in the URL, there's this kind of long identifier right here, okay? This is something called a channel. If I open up my Pico, and if I go to the sensor, you'll see I'm on the sensor Pico right here. There's a channels tab, okay? The channel is essentially a unique identifier that allows you as like some outside source, in this case it's the browser, to send events to, or events or queries, it could be either, to this specific Pico. You'll notice that the URL defines the location of the engine, but how does the engine know out of all these different Picos that are on here, how does it know to send it to the sensor? That's where the channel comes in, okay? So you'll notice I got a little error message right here. It's not shared, okay? If I go to my functions, sure enough, I've got it defined, but I also have to share it, okay? I don't want to allow anyone and everyone to call any function. Maybe there are some things that I want to keep private. So if I want to allow other people to call it, I have to explicitly share it up here. Let's share like that. Come over here and refresh. Come on. There we go. We got the result back, okay, the number 4. That's because I'm just doing 2 + 2, all right? Now let's go ahead and send an event. An event is very similar. I have some event attributes in this picture right here. I'm really not going to talk a lot about those because the lesson documents how to send like attributes with events. But just be aware that you can send attributes, or if let's say this function had like a different parameters, right? I could send a query with specific query strings that allows you to do different things. I could provide different attributes, for example. But that's not too important. for this screencast anyway. Let's just go ahead and send that event just to show you that it's working. If I refresh this, you'll notice I just get that response back. You'll notice here it's directives rather than like a single response, and that's reflected right here. And you can look through that, kind of see what it is. I'm not going to talk about that too much right now. But let's show you another way that you could send events, okay? If you've ever heard of Postman, this is just an app that you can download. It's a tool for making HTTP calls. It's kind of nice because you can save stuff in folders. Like I have this example query and I have a example event as well. I can save it and I can send it and I can get the response back. I can swap between them pretty easy. Let's call this function. You notice, okay, there I got the number 4. Perfect. And everything's hunky-dory. So let's look. There's one more method I want you to be aware of. That's the testing tab. Okay, this one I probably use this one the most, honestly. Just be aware that in your global block there's a double_ testing object, and if you provide the right information, well, let's just keep it like that. If you provide a little object under the array for queries and you define the function right there, you can actually go to your Pico, go to the testing tab, hit the little check mark right here, and you'll see you can call the function right here, and you can raise an event right here as well. Okay, so those are a few of the different ways that you can raise and send events and queries. Okay, now there's some other things like providing attributes that I don't really want to go into in the screencast. Also, there's using logs. If you look at the terminal right here, you can see, okay, here's the pass. Okay, event received, that's that event that I just sent, right? Here's that query that I just sent. You can use this terminal to kind of figure out what's going on inside your engine as the events and queries come in and out. This documentation is pretty good about describing what's going on there, so I'm not going to go too much into detail, but I hope that gives you a better understanding of what's going on with events and queries.